Alexandria, sometime in the early 3rd century. A scholar sits surrounded by scrolls in a library that has already outlived empires, working through the Gospel of Matthew, line by line, the way he does every day. He reaches chapter 2, the visitors from the east. He notices something the text itself never says: how many of them there were. Matthew counts the gifts: gold, frankincense, myrrh, 3 gifts. The scholar makes a decision that will outlast him by 2,000 years. If there are 3 gifts, there were probably 3 givers. He writes it down as a passing observation, almost a footnote. He has no idea he has just answered a question nobody asked him to answer, and that his guess is about to become, for most of the world, indistinguishable from Scripture itself. Origen didn't invent the wise men. But in one sentence, without meaning to, he may have invented the number 3. The Bible never actually says how many there were. So where did 3 really come from? And what else did we add along with it? To answer that, we first have to see what was actually there at the start, before Origen, before the crowns, before the carols. The year is somewhere around 6 to 4 BC. Judea is not an independent nation. It's a client kingdom, propped up by Rome and ruled by a man history remembers as Herod the Great, though greatness had very little to do with how he held on to power. By this point in his reign, Herod has already executed a wife and 3 of his own sons on suspicion that they wanted his throne. He is old, sick, and increasingly convinced that everyone around him is plotting against him. His wife Mariamne was executed years earlier on his own orders, followed later by 3 of his sons, Alexander, Aristobulus, and finally Antipater, each one killed after Herod became convinced they were maneuvering to take his throne before he was ready to give it up. In a kingdom run by a man like that, a rumor about a newborn rival king isn't a curiosity, it's a threat that fits a pattern he has already proven he acts on. Now look east, beyond the Jordan, beyond Syria, into the territory of Parthia and the old heartland of Babylon, a region Rome does not control, and one it has fought wars against for generations. Parthia, in particular, was not some minor neighboring territory. It was Rome's great rival power in the east, the one empire capable of standing up to Roman legions and occasionally beating them. If Matthew's visitors really did travel from anywhere near Parthian territory, their arrival in a Roman client kingdom carried a weight beyond simple religious curiosity. Envoys from a rival empire showing up in Jerusalem to ask about a newborn king would have registered as something uncomfortably close to a diplomatic incident, not just a strange visit from foreigners. This is where scholars place the most likely origin of Matthew's visitors, though the text itself never names their country. What we do know is this: this region had a centuries-old tradition of a priestly, scholarly class trained to read dreams, omens, and the movement of the stars. It also had one more thing most people forget: a large Jewish population, descendants of the Babylonian exile, who never went home. Which means it's entirely plausible that Hebrew messianic expectation, the idea that a king would rise out of Judah, was not a total mystery to scholars in this region. It may have been sitting right there in their own libraries, alongside their astrology. A journey like this was never a small undertaking either. Crossing from Mesopotamia or Persia into Judea meant weeks, sometimes months, of travel through open, often dangerous territory. People who could carry gold, frankincense, and myrrh as gifts were not wandering alone with walking sticks. They would have traveled with servants, guards, pack animals, and enough resources to survive the trip and still arrive with treasure intact. And walking straight into Herod's court to ask, to his face, where his replacement had been born, wasn't a casual detour. It was a politically loaded act, the kind of thing only envoys with some real standing would attempt. So picture the shape of it. A group of foreign scholars from a rival empire, trained to read the sky, possibly aware of a centuries-old Jewish expectation of a coming king, watching something happen among the stars that they believe points toward Judea, and deciding the discovery is significant enough to leave their own country, cross hundreds of miles, and ask a paranoid, aging client king where his successor has been born. That is the moment Matthew's Gospel actually opens with. Not a stable, not 3 crowns, not a caravan crossing a desert under a spotlight of starlight. Just one sentence, sitting quietly at the front of chapter 2, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. 6 words in the Greek text tell us who they were, and that's almost the entire picture Matthew gives us to work with. Start with the word itself. Magi. It's usually translated wise men in English Bibles, a warm, flattering, safe-sounding phrase. That's not quite what the word meant to Matthew's first readers. In the world of the first century, magos referred to a specific class of people, originally the priestly caste of the Persian and Median world, the ones who interpreted dreams and read the stars for a living. By the time Matthew was writing, the word had broadened further to include astrologers and occult practitioners more generally. It was not a neutral job title. It described a profession Israel's own law explicitly condemned. Deuteronomy is blunt about it. Sorcery, divination, interpreting omens, these are not different but respected practices in the Hebrew Scriptures. They're the very things Israel was warned never to adopt from the nations around it. Matthew didn't call these visitors scholars. He didn't call them philosophers. He called them Magi. And to a Jewish audience, that word would have raised an eyebrow before it raised any admiration. Not neutral wise men wandering in from the horizon, practitioners of exactly the kind of craft the Torah told Israel to avoid, placed in the story on purpose. That's the first thing later tradition quietly smoothed over. It's not the only thing. Return to the scholar we opened with, Origen, writing in the early 3rd century, nearly 200 years after Matthew's Gospel first circulated, is one of the earliest Christian writers we can find connecting a specific number to these visitors. His reasoning, as far as we can tell, is almost embarrassingly simple. Matthew mentions 3 gifts. Origen reasons that 3 gifts implies 3 givers. Notice what that actually is. Not a citation, not a tradition passed down from an eyewitness, an inference made by a respected early Christian thinker that later readers began treating as though it had always been the answer. Other influential voices followed his lead in the centuries after him. Figures like Leo the Great and Maximus of Turin simply took the number 3 for granted in their own writing, the way you might repeat a fact you'd always assumed was common knowledge. Each repetition made the guess feel a little more solid than the one before it, until nobody thought to ask where it had actually come from in the first place. Matthew never counts the visitors. Not once, anywhere in the passage. He counts the gifts. 3 gifts became 3 people through nothing more than one influential guess, repeated by other respected voices, until it hardened into something that felt like fact. It wasn't a head count. It was an assumption that stopped sounding like an assumption at all. And once 3 takes hold, something else starts happening almost immediately. People start disagreeing about it. If 3 were actually written plainly in the text, you'd expect the earliest generations of Christians, the ones closest in time to the events, working from the same gospel we still read today, to have painted it consistently. They didn't. In the catacombs beneath Rome, some of the very oldest surviving Christian artwork depicts this exact scene, the visitors bringing gifts to the young Jesus. In one tomb painting, there are 2 of them. In another, 4. A carved vase from roughly the same early centuries shows 8. These aren't forgeries. They're some of the earliest visual records of Christian belief we have, made by people reading the same Matthew 2 we read, and they simply did not all land on the same number, because the number was never actually there to land on in the first place. Not a settled fact everyone quietly knew. A genuinely open question that different communities filled in differently, depending on which tradition happened to reach them first, and depending on which artist, in which city, had painted the scene they happened to grow up looking at. Which brings up a detail most Western viewers have never even heard of. While the Western Church was slowly settling around Origen's guess of 3, an entirely different number was taking hold somewhere else. In parts of the Eastern Christian tradition, the number that circulated wasn't 3 at all, it was 12. A far larger delegation, reflecting a different set of assumptions about who these visitors likely were, and how such a journey would realistically have been made. Stop and sit with that for a second. Two different, ancient, sincerely held Christian traditions, East and West, reading the exact same Gospel of Matthew, and arriving at two completely different numbers. Not one obviously right answer that one side lost track of. Two independent guesses, each treated as certain within its own tradition, and neither one actually coming from the text itself. The first tradition gave the West 3. The second gave much of the East 12. Both are old. Both are sincere. Neither one is Matthew. There's another layer sitting quietly beneath all of this, and it has to do with where the gifts themselves actually came from. Gold shows up all over the ancient world, so it tells us very little on its own. But frankincense and myrrh are different. Both are resins, harvested from trees that grow almost exclusively in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, thousands of miles from Persia. If the visitors' gifts genuinely came from their own homeland's trade routes, the goods themselves point south and west, not east, toward the Persian world most people picture when they hear the word Magi. And yet by the 6th century, Christian art was already dressing these visitors in unmistakably Persian royal clothing, the pointed caps and patterned robes you can still see in the mosaics of the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna. Tradition holds that this specific costuming detail may have had a genuinely dramatic consequence centuries later. According to an account passed down about the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, when Persian forces swept through the region in 614 AD, destroying churches as they went, this particular building was reportedly spared because a mosaic on its facade depicted the Magi dressed as their own Persian countrymen. It's a striking story, and it's difficult to verify independently at this historical distance, but even if only partly true, it shows how far the Persian identity had already traveled from Matthew's silence on the subject, and how much weight later generations placed on a detail the gospel writer never actually specified. The gifts themselves picked up their own layer of meaning over time, too. Matthew simply lists them: gold, frankincense, myrrh, without explaining why these three and not others. It's later Christian reflection, showing up clearly by the time hymns like "We Three Kings" were written, that assigns each gift its own individual significance: gold for a king, frankincense for worship of the divine, myrrh for death and burial, foreshadowing the crucifixion decades before it happens. There's something genuinely moving about that reading, and it isn't baseless, since myrrh does appear again at the end of the Gospels in connection with Jesus' burial. But it's worth being clear about what kind of claim this actually is. Matthew never explains the gifts this way himself. This is a theological reading, added by later readers connecting later dots, not a meaning the text hands us directly in chapter 2. If the number wasn't in the text, the names certainly weren't either, and this is where the timeline stretches out even further than most people expect. The names most familiar today, Melchior, Caspar, or Gaspar, and Balthasar, don't show up anywhere in the historical record until roughly the 7th and 8th centuries. Multiple sources point to a chronicle called the Excerpta Latina Barbari, compiled around the 8th century as one of the earliest places these specific names appear in something close to their familiar form. That's not decades after Matthew wrote his Gospel. That's the better part of a millennium. By that point, Latin tradition had also begun assigning them countries, and even skin tones, one from India, one from Persia, one from Arabia, turning 3 unnamed foreign visitors into a symbolic representation of the entire known world bowing to Christ. A beautiful theological image. Just one Matthew never wrote, not eyewitness testimony passed down carefully for 8 centuries, a devotional tradition added slowly for reasons that had much more to do with representing all nations than with recording new historical facts nobody had previously mentioned. Nativity sets call them kings, The carol calls them kings. We three kings of Orient are. But Matthew's gospel does not call them kings, not once. So where did the crowns come from? Two Old Testament passages are almost certainly responsible. Psalm 72 describes kings bringing tribute, gold among it, to Israel's ruler. Isaiah 60 describes nations streaming toward a rising light, bringing gold and frankincense with them. Neither passage is about the Magi. Both were written centuries before Matthew's gospel existed. But early Christian readers, hunting for Old Testament patterns that echoed the New Testament story, noticed the overlapping imagery: gold, incense, foreign visitors arriving from a distance, and began blending the passages together into a single mental picture. Not a claim Matthew makes about their status, a pattern Christian readers layered on top of his account, borrowed from prophetic poetry written for a completely different context, because the imagery rhymed. Once you're watching for it, this same pattern keeps showing up. A real detail in the text, expanded by a beautiful but separate piece of scripture, until the two blur into one memory. There's one more blurring like that still waiting, maybe the biggest one of all. Nearly every nativity scene puts these visitors at the manger, kneeling beside the shepherds, on the same night Jesus was born. One image, one scene, one night. Matthew's own wording says otherwise. When the visitors finally arrive, the Greek text says they entered a house, not a manger, not a stable, not the birth scene at all. And Herod's response afterward gives us a rough sense of the timeline. When he later orders the killing of infant boys, he sets the age cutoff at 2 years old, calculated from when he'd first learned of the star. That detail only makes sense if enough time had passed that Jesus could plausibly have been anywhere up to that age. Which means the shepherds and the star followers likely never actually met. Luke's shepherds arrive the night of the birth, at a manger. Matthew's visitors arrive later, possibly much later, at a house, to a toddler, not a newborn. Not one dramatic night with every visitor gathered around a manger at once. Two separate moments, from two separate gospels, that popular tradition eventually pressed together into a single scene, because it made for a better nativity set than two long, separate stories with a gap of uncertain length in between. The layering doesn't even stop once the visitors leave Bethlehem. Later Christian legend kept following them home. Some traditions claim they eventually became followers of Christ themselves, converted years later by the preaching of an apostle. Others go further still, holding that the three met again, decades afterward in Armenia, to celebrate a Christmas together as old men, and that each of them was eventually martyred for the faith they'd once merely visited as strangers. These stories are centuries removed from anything Matthew records, with no real claim to historical reliability, but they show just how much this account kept growing long after the gospel itself had stopped talking. Every generation that loved this story seemed to feel the pull to give it one more chapter. Strip away everything the centuries added, and go back to what Matthew himself actually put on the page. Foreign visitors, practitioners of a craft Israel's own law rejected, arriving from a rival empire, in an unspecified number, carrying 3 gifts, asking Jerusalem's own religious establishment a question the religious establishment couldn't answer on their own. Notice who's actually in the room with them. Herod calls together the chief priests and scribes, the people who have spent their entire lives studying the Hebrew scriptures, and asks them where the Messiah is supposed to be born. They know the answer instantly. They quote the prophet Micah without hesitation, and then, as far as the text tells us, none of them move. Not one of Israel's religious experts makes the 5-mile trip from Jerusalem to Bethlehem to go see for themselves. It's the outsiders, the Magi. The ones practicing exactly what the law warned against, who follow the star all the way to the house. That's not a footnote buried under 2,000 years of tradition. That's the detail every later layer, the number, the names, the crowns, the single perfect night, has been quietly covering up. Not because anyone meant to hide it, but because a beautiful, comforting picture is usually easier to keep repeating than a genuinely uncomfortable one. It's easier to paint 3 kneeling kings than to sit with the fact that the people who should have recognized the Messiah first were the ones who stayed home. If you're starting to notice how many pieces of this story you'd have sworn were in the Bible and aren't, you're seeing exactly what this channel exists to do. Go back to what the text actually says, one layer at a time, instead of the version tradition handed us. If that's useful to you, it helps more than you'd think to subscribe, so the next one of these finds you. Because there's still one piece of this story we haven't touched. Not the visitors, not the gifts, the star itself. What exactly did these foreign scholars see in the sky that made them believe, with enough confidence to leave everything behind, that a king had just been born in a country that wasn't theirs? Scholars have spent centuries trying to answer that question, and it's worth being honest that none of the answers are certain. One proposal points to the sky itself. Around 7 BC, Jupiter and Saturn moved through a series of close conjunctions in the constellation Pisces, appearing to draw near each other multiple times over several months, an event rare enough that trained sky watchers of the period would almost certainly have noticed and recorded it. Ancient astrology, the very discipline the Magi practiced professionally, assigned real significance to planetary movements like this, and some scholars have proposed that a conjunction of this kind, interpreted through the lens of contemporary astrological belief, could plausibly explain what set a group of Persian or Babylonian sky readers in motion toward Judea. A second proposal points further east. Ancient Chinese and Korean astronomical records from around this same general period describe the sudden appearance of a guest star, the kind of language ancient observers used for what we would now identify as a nova or a comet, a genuinely new point of light appearing where none had been seen before. If a phenomenon like that had been visible, it would have been the sort of once-in-a-generation event capable of pulling trained observers out of their homeland to investigate. Neither explanation accounts for everything Matthew describes, though, and this is where caution matters most. The text says the star went ahead of the visitors and came to rest over a specific location, language that doesn't comfortably match how any ordinary celestial object behaves, since stars and planets don't appear to hover directly above a single house from the perspective of someone standing on the ground. Because of that gap, a considerable number of scholars conclude that whatever guided the Magi, whether it began as something astronomical or not, is presented in Matthew's Gospel as functioning as a genuinely miraculous sign rather than a strictly natural phenomenon that modern astronomy could fully reconstruct. Others hold that Matthew is using the language of a star loosely, in a symbolic or literary sense common to ancient Near Eastern royal birth narratives, without intending a precise physical description at all. This is one of the places where honest scholarship simply disagrees, and no single answer commands anything close to consensus. What can be said with more confidence is this: whatever these visitors actually saw, they didn't just interpret it privately and shrug it off. They treated it as significant enough to act on, at real personal and financial cost, in a direction that led them toward a Jewish king they had no obvious reason to care about. And that decision to act on the sign, more than the sign itself, is the piece of the story that connects to something written centuries earlier, in a part of the Bible almost nobody thinks to open when this story comes up. The book of Numbers tells us about a man named Balaam. He isn't Israelite. He isn't a prophet of Israel's God by trade or by birth. He's a diviner, hired for money, and he comes from the east, from the region of the Euphrates, the same general direction Matthew's Magi will one day travel from. A king named Balak, ruling over Moab, is terrified of the nation of Israel camped on his border. So Balak does what frightened kings in this world do. He sends for a foreign specialist in reading omens and pronouncing curses, and he hires Balaam to curse Israel before it becomes an unstoppable threat. Hold that shape for a second. A foreign king, afraid of Israel's future, calling for outside expertise to deal with the threat before it grows. Now watch what actually happens. Balaam opens his mouth to curse Israel on Balak's orders, and blessing comes out instead, 4 separate times, against his own intentions. In the last of those 4 oracles, Balaam says something that has nothing to do with the moment he's standing in and everything to do with a moment that hasn't happened yet. A star shall come forth out of Jacob, he says, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. A star, rising out of Israel, announcing a king. Spoken by a pagan diviner from the east, centuries before Bethlehem, in a story about a frightened ruler who wanted a threat eliminated before it could grow. It's worth remembering how strange Balaam's story is, even on its own terms, long before it gets anywhere near a star. Balak doesn't just ask once. He sends messengers to hire Balaam, gets refused, and sends a second, more prestigious delegation to try again. Balaam sets out, and along the road, in one of the more famous strange scenes in the Torah, his own donkey stops in the path, unwilling to move, seeing something Balaam himself cannot see. 3 separate times Balaam positions himself to curse Israel from a high place overlooking their camp. 3 separate times blessing comes out of his mouth instead, against his own professional intentions and against the wishes of the king who's paying him. By the time the 4th oracle arrives, the one about the star, Balaam has already proven himself completely unable to say anything except what's actually true, regardless of who's paying for the opposite outcome. Sit with that for a moment, because the shape of it is almost unsettling in how closely it repeats. A foreign king, afraid of a rising threat from Israel, reaches out to foreign specialists in the reading of signs. Foreign specialists in the reading of signs, of all people, become the ones who speak, or in Matthew's case, follow, a star that points toward Israel's coming king. And the frightened ruler, in both stories, is left standing on the losing side of the outcome, still trying to eliminate a future he cannot actually stop. It's worth being honest here. Matthew never quotes Balaam directly in this passage, and no reasonable scholar claims Matthew is offering a footnoted citation. What we can say carefully is this: the pattern is sitting right there in Israel's own scripture, centuries before Christ, and Matthew's first Jewish readers, the ones who knew the Torah by heart, would very plausibly have felt the echo the moment foreign star readers from the East showed up asking about a king. Whether Matthew intended the connection deliberately or simply inherited a world already shaped by that older story, the pattern itself is not invented. It was already written, which means the single most remarkable connection in this entire story isn't something Origen added in the 3rd century, or something later tradition decorated with crowns and camel caravans. It's something that was sitting in the actual text the whole time, in a passage almost nobody thinks to open when they think about Christmas. The oldest layer isn't a legend. It's scripture answering scripture, centuries apart, with nothing invented in between. Start where we started. A scholar, a library, a footnote that became a fact. 3 gifts, not 3 men, just an old, careful guess, repeated so often it stopped sounding like a guess at all. 2 Christians, in 2 different centuries, painting 2 different numbers on 2 different walls. Neither one wrong, exactly. Neither one Matthew, exactly. A name given 700 years late. A crown borrowed from a psalm about someone else. A caravan dressed in the wrong country's clothing. A single perfect night, stitched together out of 2 separate gospels that were never describing the same evening. Legends about old age and martyrdom added long after anyone could have known, layer after layer, each one sincere, each one added by someone trying to make the story feel as large as it deserved to feel, and underneath all of it, untouched the whole time, a foreign king, afraid of a threat from Israel. Foreign readers of the sky, coming from the same direction, unable to stop themselves from pointing toward a king that wasn't theirs, a star rising out of Jacob, exactly where an old, half-forgotten prophecy said it would. Not a legend that needed decorating. A pattern that was already complete. We just kept adding to something that was never missing anything. There's something quietly familiar in that shape, if you sit with it long enough. Most of us don't build our faith by carefully checking every detail against the text. We build it the way this tradition was built, one edition at a time, borrowed from a sermon, a painting, a carol, a movie, a well-meaning assumption, until eventually we're not sure anymore which parts came from Scripture and which parts came from everywhere else. It isn't dishonesty, it's just what happens to any story we love enough to keep retelling, generation after generation, each one adding a little more color than the last. There's a second, quieter recognition underneath that one, and it's a harder one to sit with. The chief priests and scribes in this story weren't lacking information. They knew exactly where the Messiah was supposed to be born, and they said it instantly, without hesitation. What they lacked was the willingness to walk 5 miles and go see for themselves. It's an uncomfortable thing to notice how easy that is to do, to hold the right information and still never move toward it, while people with far less reason to believe end up closer to the truth simply because they were willing to follow what little light they'd actually been given. Maybe that's the real question this story leaves sitting in the room, not how many visitors there were, not what their names might have been, but whether we're more like the scholars who knew the answer and stayed in Jerusalem, or the outsiders who had every reason to stay home and went anyway. The text never tells us the Magi understood everything they were walking toward. It only tells us they followed the light they had, as far as it would take them. That's a smaller, more honest kind of faith than the one usually depicted in the version of this story, with the crowns and the camels and the single perfect night. It's not the faith of people who had it all figured out before they left home. It's the faith of people who noticed something worth investigating and were willing to keep walking even though the destination didn't fully make sense yet. Most of us recognize a season like that somewhere in our own lives, whether or not we'd use the word faith for it, a period where the next right step was clearer than the whole picture, and moving forward meant trusting the light in front of us more than a plan we could fully explain to anyone else. Every layer we added to this story was an attempt to make it feel important enough to deserve retelling. It already was. It didn't need 3 kings, or camels, or a single perfect night to be worth 2,000 years of retelling. It only needed to be told the way it actually happened. If this changed the way you'll picture that story this year, that's exactly what the Scripture Project exists to do, not to strip Scripture of its wonder, but to hand it back to you closer to how it was actually written. If it's worth more people encountering it this way, subscribe and share this with someone who's never heard it told like this. And if you've got a moment, keep this small channel in your prayers. We're trying to build something honest here, and that takes more than research.